the director, Heather O'Neill. So, a very incredible piece of work, and
Thank you.
a huge piece of work. A lot to deal with. I mean, yes, there's a central core story, but it's a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Each one of their individual stories, and they're bond together. So, first and foremost, the title, did it come from the quote, or did the quotes come from the title?
It did. The film came from Maria when, we were interviewing her, and, she just said, it's not an ordinary life, and, that sort of just kind of kept coming up when we were, thinking about titles, yeah.
Well, it's certainly apt, because there's
Yeah.
nothing ordinary about it. Next question is, I see from the brief bits of resume that's in the program that you did a piece about danger to journalists covering the drug trade in Mexico. So
Yeah.
did this come out of that, covering that kind of danger and the kind of danger these women were in, or where did it come from, the idea to do this project?
The idea to do the project really came in 2006 when I was in Baghdad working for CNN, and I met Mary. And when you meet Mary, Mary is someone, you just don't forget. She's a force of nature. She's an incredible journalist. And it was just interesting because I had worked, internationally for many years and had rarely seen a camera woman. And, that seed sort of started then, that, what an incredible story. And then as I, worked at CNN for years, I would meet some of the other women. And, they were just legends. So it kind of began then. Yeah.
So they all worked for CNN?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's what I was wondering. And what were you doing in Baghdad? You're not a camera woman?
No, I'm a producer.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
I worked at CNN's documentary group, so I was making a documentary about the war.
Okay, so, and to make this, there is some fresh footage at the end, but a lot of archival footage.
Yes.
That was taken by whom, and how did you get a hold of it and cut it together?
All of the footage in the film is from the camera women, 100%. My co-producer, Rich Brooks, is here tonight, and we probably spent about a year going through all of their footage, and the film would not have been possible if they hadn't kept really their own archive. So each woman, we went to Cairo to interview Mary and came back with a suitcase of tapes and remember tapes?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So each one, had this incredible archive, so it was really kind of a process of discovery to go through it and see all these, they covered such history.
Yes, and the organizing principles were dictated to some extent by specific events, but also by global events. So Tiananmen, Arab Spring, Somalia, and each one more sort of terrifying than the last. In some of the footage, there were images of the women themselves, but that was part of their archives that had been taken by other people?
Yeah, other people, we reached out to friends that we knew, and, this is before cell phones, so there was very little actual footage of them. Some partying footage, which, we weren't super happy about in the film, but, I'm like, you're real people, and that's what journalists do.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely part of the story, so you can't get away from that.
Right.
So in some cases, there was action photography of the women in action, so that meant there was another camera crew
Yes.
in place.
Yeah.
So is that typical in a situation like that as a producer? Is that common to have more than one?
No,
one
not really. If it was a really big story, CNN would, send multiple teams on a really big story, like Somalia or Sarajevo. Today that's true to some extent, but it's still rare to actually see footage of them. So anytime we found it, we were very excited.
Exactly. So you say 2006 is when you started on this after seeing Mary in Baghdad.
I didn't start in it then. We actually started about 4 years ago.
But in 2006, a lot of these situations were in the 80s, 90s, before that.
Yeah.
And yet in 2006, you still had not seen women cameramen.
Yeah, it was really a first.
It was a first. So
Yeah.
has that changed since then? Are there more women cameramen now, or is they sort of cut the class and that was that?
I mean, CNN was unique in the fact that there were 5, and I to this day, there's no news organization international that has 5 women working around, the world at the same time. So, CNN was kind of a startup back then, and I think they had a lot of, opportunity, but they took that opportunity. There are, some camera women out there. It's getting better. So that's encouraging, and I think that's one of the reasons I made the film, was to sort of, show that this is possible, that women do work behind the scenes also.
And they made the difference. There was a discussion about there's something different about their images, and the answer is we're just really good photographers. But then later in the film, there's a little bit of an acknowledgement that maybe there's a female optic, and I'm not trying to get into any difference of gender abilities or anything else.
Right.
But would you say that's apt, or do you think it's just good photography, or do you think there's a different sensibility, possibly, for a woman cameraman?
I think for the camera women, there is. I think they did see things differently. I think they operated with a certain amount of empathy too. I think they dialed into things that, as we sort of say, weren't just kind of the bang bang, that they looked at what else was happening, and I think they did gravitate towards stories about other women and paid attention to that and what was happening, with children certainly too.
Yeah, well, that was, so clear in a lot of the images that we're looking at, as was said. Can't be exact about which person said which, but about not the bang bang, but following the civilians, the innocents. These are the people that are just caught in the middle of it, and what it's like for them. And later in the film, there's the discussion of, are you going to have a regular, an ordinary life, a more ordinary life, a more prescribed life, and that speaks to those sensibilities too. When they were in the field, that they were not able to exhibit that. But there's just so many horrifying images, so many amazing images, beautiful images, and the typical news report uses how much of that footage. It's like a documentary maker. You shoot a ton of footage, and how much actually gets used in a 90-second spot, or even a 2-minute spot. So, as a producer, speak to that a little bit in terms of how much these women shot and how many incredible images they had. How much actually got used?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think we've all seen a change in the media, in the past 10, 20 years. Stories were longer then. Now, you might have a 2-minute story if you're kind of lucky. But I think, back in the 80s and 90s, they certainly had longer stories. And they did do some documentary work as well. But, it's rare today to have, a longer piece, I think,
So the question then becomes, how much editing can there be? Because even in a magazine news format, with those 60 minutes or something like that, where you have a good 10, 15 minutes to work on a story, but still, I was just stunned by how many beautiful, incredible, powerful images, and not just the bang bang, but the human part of it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that goes to the cutting room floor, I guess, yes?
Yeah, unfortunately there was a lot that we left behind, and, you have to make editorial decisions at every moment, but, I think just listening to their stories sort of helped me select what I thought would be the best, ingredients for this film.
Well, I think you did a masterful job. I was talking about the news shows in terms of what they had to leave behind, because I think I felt honored that we got to see the images that we got to see. Some of which I have the feeling didn't get onto the news programs.
Very likely.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a difficult decision, for any editor. But yeah, they had such a body of work too, and I think that there was a certain amount of pride in being part of this film, that they were able to sort of showcase more of what they filmed.
Well, and I think that you did great justice to it, and I think that's one of the great aspects of the film, is getting to see those things, as horrifying as some of them are, and to say the least, disturbing images, but. And the concept of the PTSD, the trauma, because it was very interesting to hear that they're witnessing the trauma, but obviously they're experiencing the trauma, not only when they're getting wounded, but in just every day, just being exposed to it. But I'm not sure who it was, maybe it was Mary, that said that how she got through it was by witnessing, by bearing witness and bringing that to the world.
Yeah.
enabled her to feel a little bit better about what she was going through.
Yeah, that was Maria.
Oh, Maria.
And, again, this was a time before, people were actively talking about PTSD. And that's, I think, how they created such a bond, because they really did have each other, and they talked about things. But, they're also incredibly tough, and, they're the last ones to sort of really talk about themselves. So even during the interview process, it was hard to sort of draw it out. But they all suffer from PTSD, as many journalists do, and I think it's still hard for them sometimes.
Yeah, and the issue of guilt, I think, is incredible. The idea that you can, observers of news shows feel guilt that they live with a comfortable life where other people are not, and they look at the refugee crises and that sort of thing. But the guilt of being able to, it's survivor guilt, and it's also just sort of removal guilt, that we don't get to do this. But so many different things to deal with, and now, and because it was before cell phones, where now so much of our documentation of what's going on in the world is from people's cell phone. It's Rodney King, it's the rest of the whole thing. And so they were working at a time when that wasn't a possibility, so they were really the only eyes on it.
Yeah.
Whereas now there's a million eyes on everything that happens. So it's more than a lot of things, but it's a slice of history as well.
Yeah,
in terms of news coverage. And the curious thing to me that I thought of a couple of times is, how does it compare to the male cameraman's experience? You know what I mean?
Right.
The other people that they were competing with, and in many cases doing better than. How do those guys deal with that?
Well, Rich actually was a photographer, and he worked with all of them for many years. I don't know. Does it feel different?
I don't have a mic, but you do deal with things differently. But as I've always said, Cindy was simply the best photographer out there. And so there would have been competition between men and the women. In a lot of places they went, men just completely discounted them until they got to see their pictures. And then once they started feeding their pictures out, they were like, wow, these ladies have something going on. And so at that point, they cut their teeth, and they were able to make their names for themselves with the other photographers.
Yeah, well, and rightly so. That's incredible. So, how did you get the footage of? Did you call them together for the party at the end? I mean, at what point did you get them to sort of coordinate on this project?
Early on, we reached out to them individually and pitched the idea, and they were excited. A little reserved at first, because journalists don't always like talking about themselves. But we did actually get them together, which was really nice. And they're actually like dear friends.
Of course.
I mean, it's incredible, their bond. I mean,
Yeah.
they just picked up right where they left off.
Well,
And,
comrades in arms. And,
yeah.
going through it. Yeah,
It is.
absolutely.
It's a
But then
sisterhood.
that was a very heartwarming part of it. And Christiane Amanpour, you got her on board early on to.
Yeah, she's been a great supporter of the film. She's an incredible journalist, and you hear her saying that she grew up with these camera women, and they did teach her a lot too.
Yeah, she worked with them.
Yeah.
So amazing stuff. Yeah. So I'm, as I say, I'm blown away by it, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. So right here.
2 questions. First, how much does the equipment weigh? We see it. What are we talking
The camera,
yeah.
the older cameras weigh about 35. to
Right, 40 pounds.
Depending on what you had on it.
Yeah.
about? And the second question, as a journalist, a noble profession, bearing witness, do they think in the end was more useful for the changes it made in we who watched their things, or simply the people who saw them there and felt that somebody cared? Because an awful lot of these stories have not had happy endings. Most of them haven't had happy endings. And the sacrifice for bearing witness really has to come from the people themselves. What did they feel they achieved, besides great photography and moving pictures?
Well, any journalist has a sense of responsibility, of bearing witness, right, first. But also, they did it because they did want to try to bring about some change or bring about some awareness. And I think it's in some stories, you're right, did not have any sort of, happy ending per se, but, other times, attention was paid or, policy was changed. So I think, they will sort of, yes, it was their duty, but I think the end game always was to try to have some sort of change, based on what they were bringing, to the world.
And even if it's not changed, the raising awareness of a situation where, as was said about the famine in, I think it was maybe in Somalia, that these were the first images that ever came out.
They were, and
that precipitated the U.S. intervening to make sure the aid got through. So,
it did.
And no, that's not a happy ending, and Rwanda's not a happy ending. There's not, but to
Right.
make people aware of what's happening.
Right,
At
and
least-
it's a body of evidence too.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
certainly.
So,
Yeah.
and more power to them. And to the point of the camera, that's good to know how much it actually weighed, because there's a lot of running shots.
Yeah,
Which was
it's,
like-
it's a tough job.
No, it's not easy for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So, a filmmaking question. Some of the archival footage from them
Mm-hmm.
of intense action actually had scoring behind it. So,
Yes.
talk about that choice a little bit, and talk about how you decided which ones to put scoring behind, and the reason, and what you chose to do.
Yeah, well, we have an incredible composer, Patrick Kurse. He's an amazing guy. I've worked with him before. He's so, we understand each other. We understand our language. I think, we just sort of talked about each scene sometimes, and he would play something or, and send it to me, and we would sort of talk about it. And, maybe sometimes it was too much, especially with really intense scenes. You don't want to emotionally really manipulate people to the point, but he understands the boundaries sort of that I set for the film to sort of let it speak to itself. But, I just think it does deepen the experience.
Well, I think so too. I think it was masterfully done in a couple of cases where I think it was when the bullet wound was in Tikrit, however that's pronounced, and it wasn't music scoring, but there was a sort of a throbbing vibration behind it that was not part of the scene. So that was like a musical element of scoring that did deepen the experience, I think, without being manipulative.
Right, yeah, and that was the whole reason I really also wanted to make the film too, was to put people in that experience, you don't always think about what, that's like. So the sights and the sounds and those moments and those split-second decisions, that was kind of the point, to really immerse people in what was happening.
I think it's really well done. Other questions we have in the back up there?
Did Margaret's terrible injury affect the hiring of camera women by these news organizations after that, either positively or negatively? Like, what was the upshot of that? Because, a lot of these people were very paternalistic, which is why camera women weren't hired in the first place. So then one gets injured terribly. Was there any upshot from that?
That's a great question, and the truth is that there were discussions with, senior CNN executives about pulling some women back from the field, but Cindy and Christian got involved in those conversations, and they stopped. So, what did happen out of that experience is, journalists became targets, and news organizations started to understand the gravity of that. So protections were put into place. People got protective gear. Journalists, got combat training, how to survive. So unfortunately, it took that to sort of get, a level of protection that journalists, have to this day, which is necessary.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anybody wants to.
Right here.
Oh, okay, way in the back.
What's Cindy doing right now?
That's a great question. Cindy's really hard to track. She's usually on her bike or hiking, but she actually just took a 3-month gig with CNN in Hong Kong. So I don't know what she'll be doing next. She's always moving.
Okay, so with this film, and what's the next one for you?
We have a couple ideas in development right now, so we're kind of thinking about them.
But you're not going to talk about them.
Not yet.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, this film, a remarkable piece of work, and I hope it
Thank
gets a
you.
lot of exposure. I hope a lot of people see it,
Yeah,
and
we do
it does
too.
really well. So thanks so much for bringing it to us.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for
thank you
having
all.
us.